Welcome back to EarthSky. I'm Deborah Byrd. On Monday morning, August 29th, 2005, just after 6 a.m., Hurricane Katrina made landfall southeast of New Orleans. It became the costliest storm in U.S. history and the third most deadly. But Katrina wasn't the strongest possible hurricane. It was its aftermath that was so deadly and so damaging. I'm here with broadcast meteorologist Rachel Duensing of CBS 17 in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is also a contributor to our website, earthsky.org. Rachel, hello.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. So, Rachel, we don't know the exact death toll of Hurricane Katrina, and it's usually quoted at around 1,800 or 1,200, or we see a lot of different numbers for it. Why don't we know?
I think there are a number of factors that go into that. So originally, the report that came down, at least from the National Hurricane Center, had said that there were up to 1,800 deaths. They amended that a couple of years later and actually took it down to about 1,400 people, which is still an unfathomable amount of deaths, in this century. But I think that there are a number of factors that go into that. One, we had devastating flooding all across Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana, and even into Mississippi, which you can see some of the recovery there in the photo. And we have to think about rushing water. Sadly, how many bodies, how many people were maybe sadly never recovered. And so they were never recorded to medical examiners and coroners. And also think about what was happening at that point. This was a mass casualty event, and there's a good possibility that some people just got missed because everyone was just so overwhelmed by this point. And it matters how many people were lost, but at the end of the day, there are some people that just were lost. And it is so sad to think about losing, 1,000 people, almost 2,000 people due to one hurricane in this last century. It really is just heartbreaking.
It is. And Katrina, interestingly, was it's not the most deadly hurricane. The most deadly hurricane on record is the 1900 Galveston hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And the second most deadly is one that occurred in Florida in 1928. But since 1928, there was no hurricane that was as deadly as Katrina. And Katrina was not as deadly as, the one in Galveston or the one in Florida. So, but we got a lot better at getting people to evacuate.
And that is a big part of it. In recent years, even in, the past century, we've gotten better at communicating. We've gotten better at being able to tell people the risks and how to evacuate, where to evacuate. So the fact that, some of these most deadly hurricanes were in the 1800s or the early 1900s is a good thing. But at the same time, yes, this is 20 years ago. Hurricane Katrina, it seems like a long time ago now, 20 years ago, but 20 years in the grand scheme of things is fairly recent. So the fact that we still lost potentially thousands of people within the last 20 years due to a hurricane is also very sad and heartbreaking at the same time. So yeah, being in the top 3 deadliest hurricanes, and you mentioned at the top, the costliest hurricane in United States history as well, caused so much devastation, not just across New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana, but from Mississippi out toward Alabama and into Florida. Just massive amounts of devastation, which added up to $125 billion in damage. And that is in 2005 dollars. If you adjust that for inflation, that's it's a little more than $200 billion in today's money, which makes it the most expensive, the costliest hurricane on record. The second to that, probably one that you have had a lot of experience with being in Texas, was Hurricane Harvey back in 2017, also causing $125 billion in damage. But that was for 2017 dollars.
Right. And interestingly enough, the costliest hurricanes have pretty much all occurred in this century. So we've gotten better at getting people out of the way, but the amount of damage is greater because there's so many more people now.
Yeah,
There's so
there's
much
more.
more infrastructure now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was going
So
to say.
tell us about Katrina as a storm system. I mean, was there something about this storm that could have let us know in advance that this disaster was about to unfold?
Yes and no. It's easy to say yes in hindsight, looking back on it 20 years later. Katrina started out just like any other tropical system as a tropical depression. It actually formed from another tropical depression that didn't really develop. There's some leftover energy from that, and this was a tropical wave that came off of Africa. They kind of interacted with each other, and then southeast of the Bahamas, I believe on the 26th or 23rd of August, is when it actually became that tropical depression, and then the next day became tropical storm Katrina. And it was expected to move toward Florida, ended up making landfall just south of Hollywood, Florida. But right before making landfall, it strengthened into a hurricane. And the original forecast at the time called for it to be a tropical storm hitting Florida and then not becoming a hurricane until it moved into the Gulf. So once it made landfall, as it strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane and hit Florida, it was only over the Florida Peninsula for about 6 hours. And for most of those 6 hours, it remained a Category 1 hurricane. It wasn't until, much later in the evening that it weakened back to a tropical storm. But as soon as it moved back into the Gulf, the warm waters pretty much just allowed it to rapidly intensify, quickly became a hurricane again. And that is when it went through something called rapid intensification. It's when the winds of a tropical storm, typically a hurricane, will increase 30 knots, which is roughly 35 miles per hour in a 24-hour time period. So the waters of the Gulf were really warm. So it just blew up. It became a really powerful hurricane very quickly. And once that started happening, that's when forecasters, the National Hurricane Center, were really going, okay, this could potentially be a powerful hurricane as it continues to move into the Gulf. And that continued. It quickly became a major hurricane, which is a Category 3. And it just kept undergoing this rapid strengthening. And forecasters are saying, okay, we're seeing this trend now. We expect it to be a Category 4. Well, we know Katrina ended up becoming a Category 5 just because it tapped into that warm water. There was no wind shear, which are those mid and upper level winds that can tear apart tropical systems. There wasn't a lot of dry air either, or Saharan dust, as we've talked about before. So conditions were just kind of perfect for it to really strengthen very quickly and become the monster that it did. At its peak intensity, it had winds of 175 miles per hour. Again, a Category 5 storm. And that happened, the period of strengthening when it went from, I believe, a Category 3 to a Category 5 happened in about a 12-hour period. So it went through multiple rounds of this rapid intensification, and it just became a monster of a hurricane. And when it was really being focused in on the Gulf Coast, particularly between Louisiana and Mississippi, that was really when things started to get bad, and forecasters and everyone realized that this could have catastrophic impacts wherever it makes landfall along the Gulf Coast. So the storm itself was going to be catastrophic no matter where it made landfall. Now, knowing what we know about the Levee system in New Orleans and all of that, obviously we know that that makes things worse, and that did make things worse. But no matter where it would have ended up, it would have been catastrophic regardless.
And so it sounds like it was kind of the perfect storm, because I was going to ask you, I mean, wasn't it a Category 3 when it made landfall?
Yes. So
it
it
had
did
weakened slightly right before it made landfall?
Correct. So it did actually start to weaken before landfall, like you mentioned. So it didn't actually make landfall as a Category 5. It weakened to a Category 3. Believe that landfall in Louisiana, winds of 125 miles per hour. That is a strong Category 3 hurricane. But I always use this analogy when I explain to people with powerful hurricanes. So remember when you're a kid and you're like jumping into the pool, or you have a pool party or the public pool, and like everyone is splashing around and having a good time? That's kind of like the waves and the water in a powerful hurricane. Everything gets churned up. You got the waves, everything is very rough. Well, back where I grew up in Illinois, I'm not sure if it was a rule everywhere, but at least once an hour, everyone had to get out of the pool, if it was a public pool, and take a 10 to 15-minute break. So when everyone
You
gets
have to do that here in Austin too.
right. So it must be it must be everywhere that is a rule for a public pool, or if it was a private pool and everyone had to get out for lunch. So when everyone gets out, the water goes calm, but it doesn't go calm instantly. It takes a long time for those waves to calm down. And it's like that with a hurricane. Think of Katrina, a 175 mile per hour hurricane. That's strong winds, and that will create some really large waves. So yes, it weakened before landfall, but those waves were still that high. So as that storm moved on shore, those winds were still pushing those really high waves that were created when it was a Category 5, pushing all of that water, that storm surge, onto dry land and into these very vulnerable areas. So yes, it weakened. The winds weakened, but the water impact did not go down. And we know that it was the water that caused the most devastation, or at least most of the devastation when it comes to Hurricane Katrina, and even hurricanes in recent years past as well, but particularly with Katrina.
And so when you say the water, do you mean the storm surge or the weakness of the levees causing the flooding, or both? Or
so it was kind of the storm surge that caused the weakness in the levees. So
I see.
In terms of, if you think of a hurricane and you're looking at the way it's moving, we kind of divide hurricanes into two sides. Sometimes you'll hear it called the clean side and the dirty side, or the good side and the bad side, whatever it ends up being called. But the east side of that storm, the right side of the storm, is always where you're going to have the worst impacts. That's where the strongest winds are maximized, and that's where the storm surge is going to be the worst. So if we look at where Katrina made landfall, southeast Louisiana, the strongest of the winds and the highest storm surge was pushed into coastal Mississippi. So that's why we had that record-breaking storm surge of 28 feet in Mississippi.
Wow.
It wiped out blocks of homes. It took whole casinos and pushed them inland. That storm surge traveled 6 miles inland. And where that storm surge was actually moving up the bays and up the rivers, when it followed those paths, it traveled 12 miles inland. That is devastating storm surge that moved onto coastal Mississippi. But when it comes to sort of what would typically be the better side of a hurricane, because of the way the wind direction, everything, that's the side that parts of Louisiana was on. But because you still had significant storm surge that was going into Lake Pontchartrain, that really rose the lake levels, and they still had significant storm surge all along the coastline of Lake Pontchartrain. And that's what ended up overwhelming the levees and going over a lot of these flood walls. So it was definitely a bit of both. You had the side where it was purely the weather impact in coastal Mississippi, and then you had the Louisiana side that was for sure a weather impact as well. But knowing what we know now about the levee system and how it may not have been properly maintained, so when you had that storm surge that was not able to be held back by these flood walls and these levees, that made that significant flooding in New Orleans in particular so much worse. And that's why they had, at times across portions of New Orleans, 20 feet of water. I mean, 80% of the city was flooded at one point, and some of that flooding was up to 20 feet of water because the levees and the flood walls broke or were breached.
And so what did we learn from Katrina? I mean, there must be lots of things that we learned, but can you articulate some of what we learned?
Yeah, so we have learned a lot from Katrina. So that is the thing about meteorology. Meteorology has been around for thousands of years. People have been predicting the weather for thousands of years. But in terms of modern meteorology, we call it the satellite era. It's relatively new, all things considered, roughly the last 60 years. So we've been making amazing strides in forecasting, and especially in how to better communicate risks and threats. So kind of what we were talking about before with the deadliest hurricanes on record, it was before there was a lot of really great communication, and now our communication has greatly improved. So before Katrina, there were no storm surge warnings. Now we have storm surge warnings, so we can put out, or at least the National Hurricane Center can put out, hey, here's where we expect the worst of the storm surge. Here's how high we expect it to be. Now they do better communication going forward. Here's what we can expect with hurricanes going forward. Here's an area that we are monitoring that could become a tropical system going forward. And also a lot of changes in not just how to better communicate, but better communicating that across all platforms, all agencies. But I will always say there is a very human aspect to weather that is, dare I say, unpredictable. You never know how people are going to react to a storm. Some people, the question always comes up, why didn't these people evacuate? Why didn't these people evacuate? And it is a valid question, but for some people, they can't easily evacuate. Maybe they don't own a car. They don't have a friend or a family member who has access to a car that can take them to a safe place. Maybe they can't afford to leave their home or wherever they live. There are so many factors that we may not know about that can keep people from evacuating. So it's also telling people, okay, if you can't go 2 hours up the road, like some folks, how can you be safe? The National Hurricane Center always says, hide from the wind, run from the water. So if you are in an area that is prone to storm surge, that is prone to flooding, that is when you need to really evacuate, especially inland, more to an area where you are not going to be put in danger from the flooding or the storm surge. Most modern homes, most modern apartment buildings and condos can withstand strong hurricane force winds. You may still have windows that get blown out, but most structures now can withstand the winds. But it really is the water that is the most deadly part of any hurricane or tropical system. So just communicating to folks, okay, if you can't stay away from your home for days on end, how can you at least get you and your family far enough away from the water to be safe? That communication is still a challenge, but it has been getting better in recent years.
Well, I hope everyone who's listening, here we are coming up on the peak of hurricane season for 2025. I hope everyone who's listening will take it to heart and have their plan ready if you live along the coast, and stay safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rachel.
And that's why it's so important to have that plan in place ahead of time, so that way you're not panicking or caught in a crowd if you're trying to evacuate to keep your family safe.
Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for
Really
having
appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you all for watching One Earth, One Sky, EarthSky.